Genesis 12 is in fact the halfway point of the Bible. There's been 2,000 years of history leading up to Genesis 12, and the rest of the Bible is 2,000 years. And that's part of why many people don't trust or don't believe the first 11 chapters of the Bible are anything more than myth, because there's such an economy of words. But it would be a terrible error to assume that those first 11 chapters of Genesis are myth, because the style of the writing, the way it's written, it's clearly historic narrative. Introducing Abraham, who is the subject matter for our sermon this evening. Where we're going to start is in Genesis 11. In verse 14, we see another important man in history. That's Eber. Eber is the 14th generation from Adam. Eber is the man from whom we get the term Hebrew. And what Eber means is to pass through the water or from the other side of the river. When you see Israel passing through the Red Sea, that's tipping its hat back to Eber, this man who passed through the water or who was from the other side of the river. It's only the Jews today that claim to be Hebrew. The Hebrews is a much larger group of people, but it's only the Jews who keep that name of Hebrew. And if we skip over to verse 26 of chapter 11, we see now Terah, and Terah is the 19th generation from Adam. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor and Haran. And here we have the introduction of Abraham, or Abram. Abram is the 20th generation from Adam. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, Haran. Haran begot Lot, and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abraham and Nahor took wives, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarah was barren. She had no children. Abraham is one of the most famous men in human history. He is certainly revered by Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims. And when you investigate Abraham in the Bible, he's mentioned no less than 73 times in the New Testament. So he's quite a prominent figure. And in the entire Bible, he's mentioned 285 times. So he's a significant figure in the Bible. We're going to look at the call of Abraham. Most people would turn straight to Genesis chapter 12. At the start of Genesis 12, it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family." That's actually not the call of Abraham. This is a retelling of the call of Abraham. We've got to go to the New Testament to actually investigate and find the call of Abraham. And in Acts chapter 7, we see the true call of Abraham. Stephen is brought before the council and ordered to give a defence of himself. They're looking to kill him. And rather than give a defence for himself, what Stephen does is sees an opportunity to give a history lesson to the Jews and to give a gospel presentation to these people. And what Stephen says, "Brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran." It was when he was in the city of Ur that God called Abraham. And God said to him, "Get out of your country, get out of Ur, get away from the Mesopotamians, get away from the Chaldeans, and from your relatives." That seems pretty harsh. Imagine if God said to you, "Get away from your family." And God says, "Come to a land which I will show you." Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. And Abraham sets off. And with good intentions, he sets off. But when he gets to a city called Haran, he stops there, short of the land of promise. And it's not until his father passes away, Abram actually leaves Haran and goes into the land of promise. So why would it be that God gives Abram this tough message? We've got to go to one other reference before we start in a run through Genesis chapter 12. Joshua, speaking to the people of Israel, says in Joshua 24 verse 2, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times." A little play on that Hebrew word. "And they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac." I think we see there an almost certain reason why God says not only get out of but leave your family. This is a family of idol worshippers. And the Joshua text strongly tells us that Terah, his father, Abraham's father, was an idol worshipper, but I think it strongly implies also Abraham himself was an idol worshipper. God called this uncircumcised Gentile out of the land of Gentiles. Now, we're not told specifically what gods Terah and Abraham and Nahor worshipped. Modern day archaeologists have uncovered some important information about The chief god of was the moon god Sin, S-I-N. Terah, Abraham, Nahor worshipped the moon god Sin. This was the chief god of the city. In fact, and this moon god were so closely aligned that the city of in ancient manuscripts is often just simply called Nannar, which is another name for the moon god Sin. Archaeologists have also uncovered a great temple to the moon god Sin. And archaeologists have investigated the city of Haran, and guess what the chief god of Haran was? Sin. Jewish tradition also tells us Terah was an idol maker. God called Abraham out of this region, and the people of Arabia continued to worship this moon god even into the time of Muhammad. During the time of Muhammad, the Arabs of the region and his people continued to worship this moon god, which was symbolised by the crescent moon that we see so commonly displayed on Muslim ambulances, on minarets, on Muslim flags. The harsh reality is the moon god of Muhammad's day is the same moon god that God called Abraham to get away from. That god had a title of Al-Ilah. Al-Ilah. Al means the, Ilah means God in Arabic. Al-Ilah, abbreviated to Allah. And this Allah that you hear about, worshipped by the Muslims, is definitely not the God of the Bible. The origin of their God is the pagan Arabic moon god called Sin, whose title was Al-Ilah or Allah. God called Abraham away from this God. Modern day Muslims have been duped into following after this moon god. Many Muslims claim Abraham as their father, and they don't realise that Abraham was told to get away from this culture, get away from this God. Let's turn back to Genesis 12 and keep reading from Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord had said to Abram, and that had is the indication, this is a retelling of the original call. And God said, get out of your country, from your family. And here we're given extra detail, from your father's house. So when Abraham left his father came with him. And as he got to Haran, his father was still with him. And it wasn't until his father died that Abraham was finally able to get away from the influence of his father and go to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We don't know for certain how long it was from God's original call of Abraham when he lived in to when he eventually obeys God, but probably many years where he missed out on these promises and this blessing from God. And I think we can learn an important lesson. If we have a strong inclination where the will of God is for our lives, we know what is the right thing to do, and we stay outside that will of God, what blessings are we missing out on? We don't have these specific promises like Abraham's been given, but God is looking to pour out his blessings on us. And if we're not walking in his will, if we're not obedient to him, we're missing out on the best that God has to offer us. This statement, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, this isn't just a proclamation relating to Abraham. This is a proclamation that goes on and relates to his descendants. Same statement applies today. My strong suggestion to the people who are running the United Nations is stop putting up rulings against Israel. Watch out. God is going to bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. It's a dangerous thing to curse the nation Israel. And the final statement in the promise God makes to Abraham is, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And this is one of the many veiled promises of the coming Messiah King in the person of Jesus Christ, the greatest of Abraham's descendants. When Christ died on the cross and rose again, he made way, the possibility for us to enter back into relationship with God. Let's keep reading. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. What did God say to Abraham? Depart from your family, from your father's house. Lot is his nephew. Lot is part of Abram's father's house, and Lot comes along with him. Even after Terah died, Abram still isn't in full obedience with God by bringing Lot along with him. Verse 5, then Abram took Sarah his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, suggesting slavery, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Morah, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Perhaps a decade, perhaps 2 decades later, after the original direction from God, and finally, he's in the land of promise. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, this is God's second appearance, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So God says, where you're standing, this is it. This is the land of promise. And the first thing Abram did, this tent dweller, he builds an altar. He builds a permanent rock pile to remember that promise of God. This is the land. This is the land that God promised. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar, his second altar, in the land of promise. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going still towards the south, or the Negev. I think it's at this point where we see this statement, and called on the name of the Lord, that Abram finally makes the decision. Those gods of the Mesopotamians, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, the god of the gods of Haran, I'm leaving them behind. I'm now in the land of promise, and it's from this point I'm going to call on the name of the Lord. He is my God. Yahweh is my God. Now there was a famine in the land, and what we see in the life of Abraham, at least 7 tests that God places in the life of Abraham. The first test was his calling. Leave your family, leave your city, go to a place that I'll tell you. And he wasn't very successful in obeying that test. He partially complies, and it takes him some years before he fully complies. The second test God gives Abraham is once in the land of promise, he sends a great famine. And Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. Abram just walked straight out of the land of promise. There's an economy of words, and God often doesn't do a lot of commentary on the things that occur and leaves us to make deductions and investigations for ourselves. But it would appear to be that as Abram leaves the land of promise, he walks outside the will of God. The reason I have some confidence in making that speculation that he's stepping outside of the will of God is look at his behaviour when he goes to Egypt. Because we read in verse 11, and it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarah his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." Sarai must have been spectacularly good looking, a woman in her mid-60s. And what he does is concocts this half-truth. Sarah is the half-sister of Abram, but a half-truth is a full lie. And that's why I think he's stepping outside the will of God. I think that's evidence, and that narrative provides the evidence. So it was when Abraham came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. Abram was quite right. His wife was very beautiful, and it was noticed by the Egyptian Pharaoh. Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys and camels. So because of Abraham's lie and deception, not only was his wife taken from him, preparing to become the wife of Pharaoh, Pharaoh lavished upon Abram great wealth in possessions, in donkeys, in servants, in camels. The response in verse 17, "But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife." We're not told how this came about, but Pharaoh, seeing these plagues, no doubt started to do his own investigation. What's going on? Everything was going fantastically well, and now all of these plagues, the gods are against us. Perhaps Pharaoh said, "Go and find out what's going on." And his servants and his priests came back to him and reported, guess what? Sarah is not just Abram's sister, it's his wife. And this Abram, he worships Yahweh. He worships a great and mighty God. And perhaps that's the message that went back to Pharaoh, because we see the response of Pharaoh. Normally such a scenario, you'd see a king or a great powerful man who would simply have Abram executed. But far from being executed, he was terrified. And Pharaoh called Abraham and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife." That's in fact what he was preparing to do. "Now therefore, here is your wife, take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Pharaoh throws him out of Egypt. And not only does he throw him out of Egypt, he throws him out with all of the possessions that he'd lavished upon Abram as well. So Abram leaves Egypt a very wealthy man. And it's, of course, the providence of God, and God, in a very kind and gracious fashion, pushes Abraham back in to the land of promise by the hand of Pharaoh. Chapter 13. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Notice again that statement, "and Lot with him." The first test of God, get away from your family. All these years later, Lot's still with him. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. Can anyone else think of something else that Abram might have picked up in Egypt? He may have. He certainly did that, yeah. The thing that's not in the text, he probably picked up Hagar. Hagar was an Egyptian. Hagar was the handmaiden of his wife. And we're not going to get to it today, but because he went to Egypt and he came back with this slave girl, tremendous problems came from that. It's not too dramatic a thing to say that millions of people have died because Abraham went to Egypt and picked up a slave girl called Hagar. We don't always know the ramifications of our decisions. We don't get to see the big picture. But as children of God, as people of faith, we should be stepping out and seeking to do the will of God, because we never know what the consequences of our actions might be. Abram couldn't possibly have known going to Egypt would result in dozens and dozens and dozens of wars. We're seeing today still some of the ramifications of Abraham going to Egypt, even today. The lesson is, if you know what God's will is for your life, just do it. don't rebel against God, don't go out into Egypt, into the world. Sometimes very difficult to know what God has planned for you, and I admit I often am not sure what God's will is for my life. But if we step out in faith, make sure we're not making obvious sinful decisions, prayerfully consider God and always bring before God the decisions of our life, I think we're on good ground to believe that we'll be staying in the will of God. Verse 3, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been, at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Notice again the repeat of this. He's outside the place of promise, delaying years. He arrives in Canaan, he calls on the name of the Lord. He leaves the land of promise, goes to Egypt, does some things that he shouldn't have done, comes back to the land of promise and calls on the name of the Lord. I don't know anything about most of your lives. I don't know where you're standing with God at the moment. Even if you're living a life that's not right before God, you have the option today, right now even, to come before God and repent. Come before God, call upon the name of the Lord, call upon Jesus. Ask Jesus to forgive you for anything in your life that's not right and step back in the will of God. So be like Abraham. Turn back and call upon the name of the Lord. First test, Abraham's call. He didn't do very well. Second test, famine. He did a runner out of the land straight away. He didn't do very well in his second test. His third test, God has given Abraham great wealth. And he starts, I think Abraham's response to his great wealth is pretty good. He's very gracious towards Lot. Let's read the account in verse 5. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. So Lot, because he went along with Abraham, he's done very well as well. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. Abraham is a man of faith. We know that from the biblical account. And God has told Abraham very clearly, that land that you stood on, where you built that altar, God had promised that that land be yours. And what Abraham effectively does is stand up and say that Jordan River is the dividing post. Lot, you can either go east of the Jordan River or west of the Jordan River. And west of the Jordan River was what God had already promised Abram. It takes great faith for Abraham to say, you pick that promised land of promise or that land over there. And he gives Lot the choice. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Once again, circumstance has overcome Abraham. Abraham wasn't able to fully comply with God's first command, leave your family. His father had to die before he left his father, and now the great wealth of these two men pushes them apart. Circumstances are pushing Abraham towards being inside the will of God, and he separates from Lot because of their wealth. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. In case you think I'm making too big a deal about Abraham still being with Lot, the Bible, in its economy of words, confirms that that was an issue in the next verse. And this is God's third appearing to Abram. Then the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him. Makes it very clear. He's just explained the separation of the two, and he says, the Lord appeared to Abram after Lot separated from him. Now you're fully compliant with my first test, with my first command to you. You didn't really want to do it. Circumstances pushed you into doing it, but after Lot had separated from him. And look what God does at that point. You're now fully compliant with what I told you to do. Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. Even all the land that Lot takes is Abram's, by the way. But God says, everywhere you look, for all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. Abram's fully compliant now with the will of God, and God gives him even more details of this promise. Everything you see is yours, and it's your children. He has no children, by the way, at this point. Forever. Not for the next 100 years, not for the next 1,000, not for the next 2,000, not for the next 3,000, forever. And I've got a sad piece of news for the Palestinians living in the West Bank of the Jordan River, and for the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. That's land that God promised the descendants of Abraham. That land belongs to Israel. And those who would seek to oppose God, remember the promise? I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. Just look at the state of the people and the places around Israel. Look at what's happening in Syria. Look at what's happening in Iraq. Look what's happening in Jordan. Look what's happening in Egypt, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in Iran. These are people who hate Israel, who curse Israel at every opportunity. And the turmoil that's occurring there, I think, is the judgment of God. You don't curse the people of God. You don't curse the Israelites. It's a dangerous thing to do. And I think they've just sowed this terrible seed and they're reaping the consequences of it. But God promises to Abraham, that land, everything you see, it's yours and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth. He hasn't got a son. His wife is barren. He has no children. There's no hope of him having any children. And God's saying, I'm going to give you so many children you can't count them. It's the dust of the earth. It's the sand on the sea. It's the stars in the sky. If you can count them, you'll be able to count your children. I'm going to give you millions and millions and millions of descendants. And yet there's not the slightest hint in this text that Abram doubts that Almighty God, Yahweh, can deliver on his promises in his life. And God says, arise, walk in the land, through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Third altar he built. I don't know how God's going to do it. It doesn't seem possible, but I'm going to build an altar because God has just appeared to me and told me this is mine and my descendants, and I'm going to have a great multitude of nations that come from me and Sarah.